First of all, using this opportunity and to introduce Father Eric, I would like to say that today's session, today's conference might have been the most prominent of all because it has a very long history and of course founded by His Eminence, the late Metropolitan Anthony. It has very deep roots, and in the conference course there were many prominent speakers, many prominent guests, including here many hierarchs of our church, but there was never a case that a patriarch or a primate of a church was presiding over a conference. And in spring, when I was in the United States, I had a talk with His Beatitude, the primate of the Orthodox Church in America, Deacon, Archbishop of Washington, and Metropolitan of all America and Canada, and it was his great desire and the wish of his heart to be here with us at the conference. But unfortunately, he is too busy these days, and that's why we are hoping to see him at the conference next year. But the conference is not less prominent today because we have a very important representative, the Chancellor of the Orthodox Church in America, Father Eric, with us. And we may see that the cake of our conference was baked properly and had many layers, but we need to have a cherry on top of the cake. And I hope that Father Eric is the person who can provide us with one.
So, Father Eric is no stranger to our conference. He was here about 3 years ago, I think, with a paper on the conference was dedicated to mission. And this actually is one of Father Eric's special interests. He has a great deal of experience in the whole field of mission and evangelism in particularly the Orthodox Church in America, which he has been the secretary since 2008. Someone well acquainted with the Orthodox world as well, through that role, representing the Church in World Council of Churches and inter-church contacts. He was complaining over his beer in the bar last night about how much of his life he spent on aeroplanes, but such is the fate of those who rise to the dizzy heights of church administration. I also see that he's chaplain to the Boy Scouts of America. Okay? So, an interesting role. So Father Eric is going to talk to us about the phenomenon of foolishness of Christ, particularly in the North American context. So, welcome, Father.
Christ is risen. You say that differently than we do. Indeed, He is risen. He is risen indeed. So that's good. I have to keep little differences. I would like to first off give greetings on behalf of His Beatitude Metropolitan Deacon, as you said, Archbishop of Washington, Metropolitan of all America and Canada, and also the Holy Synod of Bishops. And it is by his blessing that I was asked to come here in his place. So I'm much lower than the Metropolitan, so don't build up too many expectations. But he sends his blessings and his greetings, and he is thankful. There's always been a very good and solid relationship between the Diocese of Sourozh and the OCA, and we hope to continue that in the future. There were many people who went to seminary at our seminaries in the United States, and there's been our clergy who've been over here studying at the Cambridge Institute. So there's always a wonderful sort of cross-pollination that we hope will continue. On behalf of this Beatitude, I'll be talking a little bit about this person, St. Herman of Alaska. He sent these cards for everybody. I think I have enough for everyone. I'll give them to Father Joseph, and he can figure out how to hand those out. But that's with the blessing of his beatitude. The other thing I want to apologize in advance before I start my talk is that I'm an Italian from New Jersey. And so I speak fast, and I speak with my hands. And my first mission parish was in Billings, Montana. You know, they sent a good boy from New Jersey to Montana. I actually had a parishioner there who knew me as a kid, who was my school teacher. And the first sermon I gave, which was on Pentecost, and I'm preaching, and I'm going like this, and all the people are going like this. And they say, Father, we don't understand the words you're saying. So if I do that, I apologize to my translator in the back, and I'll try to not speak so fast. Father Raphael, and the other times I speak, he sometimes goes, slow down, Father. So, but it is my pleasure to be here. And when I was asked to do this particular topic, which is not necessarily my area, I thought about how do we look at the Fools for Christ as evangelists? Because in effect, that's really what they are. And so, also looking at the context, I thought it would be interesting to hear about some foolishness, shall we say, in Christ, foolishness in Christ, from a North American context. And I've taken 3 particular saints, 2 canonized, 1 yet to be canonized, and to kind of give you an understanding of the flavor of how it manifests itself in North America. So with that, I will start the paper. Because everyone can hear me fine, right? That's one thing I'm never accused of, is being too quiet. I want to start with a quote from St. Nikolai Velimirovich. He's St. Nikolai Zhicha. In America, we call him St. Nikolai of South Canaan. He was a Serbian bishop who was placed in Dachau. And after he survived Dachau, he settled at our monastery at St. Tikhon's in Pennsylvania. So he is one of our one that we claim as our own. In fact, my church in Montana was the first church ever named after him. So there's a great love for him. So I'm going to start with him, and then we'll go into a bit of the talk. He wrote in the prologue from Ohrid, "Oh, that all of us who are baptized with the sign of the cross could take this seriously and receive with contentment the name of fool for the sake of Christ. Let us rejoice and be glad if unbelievers so call us, for that means that we are near to Christ and far from the unbelievers. Let us rejoice and be glad and proclaim with a strong echo in the world, yes, yes, indeed, we are fools for Christ's sake." Introduction. I was perhaps 16 years old, and I was accompanying my diocesan bishop, Archbishop Peter Lahoulier. I think maybe some of you may have known him. He was a famous canonist. And my parish priest as a subdeacon to St. Tikhon's monastery for a celebration. St. Tikhon of Moscow founded this monastery in 1905 and has served as a spiritual center for the Orthodox Church in America ever since. It was also a place where St. Nikolai, whom I mentioned, spent his final years after his internment in Dachau during World War II. As I was walking, my parish priest pointed out a lone figure in the distance, disheveled, moving silently in the shadows. He said I should meet him, as I probably will never meet a holier person in my life. And I did go over and receive his blessings. And I distinctly remember, this is to my mind now how many years later, the feeling of peace and love that emanated from this man. I could not explain it. I just knew he radiated holiness. I would find out later his name was Archimandrite Vasily Filipovich. He was renowned in the monastery for his honesty, his holiness, his simplicity of faith. He had left Russia in 1914 and was unable to return after the revolution. And he never again saw his wife or his children. He came to the monastery in 1932 and attended to Bishop Amfiloki and remained there for 54 years. He baked bread, he attended the gardens and the beehives, beloved beehives, and served other monks and orphans. Stories about him abound. A tattered Bible that he read on a bench in the monastery, the animals that came to him while he prayed, his levitation in the monastery cemetery, his rebukes to the local bears to leave his beloved beehives alone. He loved children And there's one story when he was asked by a child if he had ever seen God, he replied, "Oh yes, I see him all the time." The little boy then asked, "Well then, what does he look like?" And Father replied, expressing a very important dogmatic truth, "He looks just like you." And those who knew Father, he walked around a tattered robe, his hair was all over the place. He just looked that part, but he lived that way. And everyone just knew that and let him be who he was. So Father Vasily represents a particular, albeit not a unique, manifestation of holiness in the North American context. Like many saints in the Orthodox Church in America, he came from elsewhere, settled into a new country and a new language. Some of these saints exhibited attributes which could be likened to the Russian Yerdevi or the Greek Sourozh. But perhaps with the unique context in North America, the New World, allowed them to manifest themselves in a different and distinctly North American manner. This paper will explore 3 North American saints and their manifestation of foolishness for Christ. The holy foolishness that is manifested in North American context is often seen as a mirror against the secular society, where their adherence to the Orthodox faith, a minority religion in North America, demonstrates a different holiness. While I do not intend to go into the full historical and theological explanations of the Fool for Christ, it is important to understand the underpinnings which provide the basic of North American context. The Fool for Christ, and we've talked about this for the last couple of days, really shows up in the history of church at select moments. The reason for this is not entirely clear, but it would seem whenever the church had an issue with the power differential, the Holy Fool is there as a witness to the folly of power. For example, the Desert Fathers record various figures who fled society, usually at their own choice, to live a marginal existence in the desert, testing the resolve and humility of those who chose that particular path by fleeing the cities. This particular type of saint disappeared as the church became more established. The Fool for Christ showed up again during the early times in the Byzantine Empire, when the church was triumphal in its establishment of Christianity. Again, this particular type of saint disappeared for many centuries as the church expanded. The high point for the Holy Fool is the 15th through the 17th century Russia, certainly a time of churchly power struggles with the state. Mount Athos also has a tradition for the Fools for Christ, which seem to be related to the controversy of hesychasm in the early centuries. So therefore, such activities can be seen as a release valve of sorts, in which the Fool of Christ shines the light in the church and forces the church to confront its earthly power in a unique and often powerful way. There are certain, I know this question was asked, there are certainly some Old Testament accounts which display aspects of holy foolishness. For example, Isaiah walking around barefoot and naked, Ezekiel using dung to cook his food, David feigning madness or dancing naked. The New Testament, the Apostle Paul speaks about holy foolishness in 1 Corinthians. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are honorable, but we are despised. And this passage is often used as the basis for the category of holiness, which of course leads to all questions about its applications. What does it mean to really be a fool for Christ? Or are you just being a fool? The whole question of holy foolishness revolves around that question. Is it genuine, or is it affected? Metropolitan Calhoun, and I'm relieved he's not here because it's always difficult to quote someone when he's actually in your presence because you want to make sure you get it right, writes in his essays, Fools for Christ in Christ as prophet and apostle. When dealing with the vocation of folly for Christ's sake, it is an exceptionally delicate task to distinguish the genuine from the counterfeit, the holy innocent from the unholy fraud, the man of God from the dropout, the hippie from the streaker. How are we to test the Spirit? The frontier between breakdown and breakthrough is not clearly marked. So that question of how to test the Spirit remains at the central point in distinguishing the genuine from the fake. Metropolitan Calhoun outlines 5 attributes for the Fool for Christ, which is a roadmap from distinguishing the true from the fraud. These are total freedom in the world, being a stranger in the world, extreme humility to the point of being mocked, the prophetic vocation, and finally, being an apostle for the Christian faith. While there are certain other attributes, some being unique to this difficult calling and even different from person to person, all holy fools seem to exhibit a few of these attributes in their lives. A question outside the scope of this paper is whether the vita of these saints are written according to the formula that highlights these attributes. In other words, they are fools, so therefore they must have these attributes. Or whether these genuine attributes that must exist in order to be classified as saint in this category. Leaving that question aside, let us assume that these are genuine attributes for a saint and are as such a typology. Total freedom is the first attribute. Metropolitan Kallistos writes, he bears witness to the preeminent value of the person rather than the rules. By placing oneself so low, without any possessions, at times without even a home, means that the holy fool is totally free and unencumbered in the world. What? A little bit slower. Yes, I knew I was going to do that. He or she owns nothing. So therefore, nothing can be taken from them. There is nothing to control them. They are totally free from want or desire. The holy fool is free to wander and to live in the world. The early desert fathers speak of them as wandering between the desert and the city, sleeping in odd places, possessing little if any clothing. Basically, they live like some of the homeless people that we all see all too often in today's modern cities. In that freedom, they are free to speak as they want, calling out those who abuse power, and demonstrating through their lifestyle that even the lowest of the low are humans and the children of God. They may beg for food and money, but often they secretly give that same food and money to the poor. And it is often after their death that this fact comes to light. And by doing so, they are not just alleviating the situation of the poor and the destitute, but they are drawing attention to the same by focusing society on the plight of the poor. Being a stranger in the world is the second attribute, is alienating themselves from society, the same society they often mock. The apartness they live also allows them to aim a mirror on society, reflecting back its folly and hypocrisy for all to see. Metropolitan Kallistos writes, mocking the world, the fool strips the mask of hypocrisy, demystifies the roles, and reveals the presence of the human, the all too human, behind the facade of dignity and honor. He uses shock tactics to awaken others from their own self-absorbed complacency and allows people to see God in all rather than focusing on the Pharisaic aspects of church life and rules. The fool often is immersed in scriptural knowledge, which is leveraged and repeated to great effect. He points out and confronts hypocrisy by outrageous actions and words, however, never degrading or mocking Christ. His teachings, or the scriptures, the fool is often immersed. He uses that as his leverage. It is especially difficult charism to have the third attribute, that of total humility. Often likened to kenosis or self-emptying, of Christ himself who empties himself so completely, even unto death, in order to save others. This self-emptying or total humiliation take on many forms, including feigning insanity, or perhaps even descending into madness, or becoming an object of scorn or mocking, in order to totally identify with the kenosis of Christ himself. By becoming the lowest and the mocked, the fool, Christ-like actions and activities remind others of Christ's total humility of being scorned, beaten, crucified. But as Christ's total humiliation is salvific, so too the kenosis of the holy fool. The kenosis of the holy fool shines light on Christ's action and are salvific. Again, Metropolitan Kallistos writes, the fool's vocation is the desire to preserve humility, the willing acceptance of humiliation. Very often the holy fool is a prophet, speaking truth to power with boldness and zeal. He is a sign, bearing witness to the Christ's kingdom is not of this world. He points out the conditions of the world, the church, the leaders, and with great flourish reminds these saints what will happen if they do not change their ways. Very often, it is not so much with the fool's words, which are used sparingly or pointedly, but with the fool's actions, which have deeper and greater meaning. The fool saves others not so much through anything that he says, although what he is, through the entire manner of life. He is a living parable. So as Christ employed parables to comment on the state of the world, faith and religiosity, so the fool, by living and acting in a particular manner, comments to a particular audience in a particular place and time. As a side note, fools may even employ miraculous healings and actions which are not necessarily attributed to the person at the time, but is attributed over time as coming from them. Miracles are not always employed, but when they are, the life as a parable becomes a powerful statement. Finally, the one that seems to resonate most with the North American saints is that of apostle. The apostle is one who is sent to bring the gospel to a people. Whether that gospel is active or passive, we'll talk more about that later, it is the fool's words and activities, in fact, the fool's entire life, which is dedicated to bringing the gospel to the world. Through his feigned madness, he acts as a missionary, preaching the good news of salvation to those who cannot be reached in any other way. The fool is not just preaching the gospel in a unique way, the fool is manifesting the gospel in a unique way. Those who otherwise would ignore the gospel are now confronted with it. The gospel cannot and will not be ignored because the fool places it directly in the person, both in words and deeds. If Christ speaks of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and those in prison, Matthew 25, then Christ actually means it. The fool makes society recognize and confront the poor, the hungry, the sick, the interned by becoming one of them. The rest of society has to either deal with it or not, and ultimately takes the words of Christ seriously or not. It is not an academic exercise, but it's real. Even the most marginal in society, the insane, the beggars, the sick, the homeless, those whose vocations place them outside of society, prostitutes, lepers, etc., are all put before society, either to be preached to or to be preached about. The fool boldly proclaims, "Here they are, and what are you going to do about it?" The fool reminds society that the good news is for everyone, as Christ consistently and constantly reiterates. And society cannot pick and choose which people to save. All are worthy of salvation, even the most marginal and discarded. In his, Metropolitan Callistos, in his canonic Maximalism, the fool is a profoundly evangelical figure. He dies daily, and therefore, because crucifixion and resurrection constitutes a single event, daily he rises again from the dead, the icon of the humiliated Christ. He is therefore an icon of the great joy of the Transfiguration. So now I'd like to just move on to our examples in the North American context. Currently, there are 14 canonized saints in North America. There are no North American saints who are categorized fools for Christ. For that matter, there are a few modern Orthodox saints canonized as fools for Christ. So this is not unusual in today's church. The idea of the holy fool, therefore, has become more of historical nostalgia rather than a contemporary phenomenon. Some people, and especially converts to the Orthodox faith, particularly zealous converts, look to the holy fools as a validation of correct and proper orthodoxy against the current and secular and political climate in both North America and traditional Orthodox countries. They project a certain nostalgia on these figures who represent the counterculture against the perceived weakening of the Orthodox faith. So it is not uncommon for Orthodox converts to take on names of such saints, fools for Christ, Xenia of Petersburg being a very popular one for women. Such saints demonstrate that their own purity of faith. So we always have to be careful about how we look at them. Because I'm just going off the text a little bit, by taking those names and idolizing them, we can sometimes project onto them something that they're not meant to be. And so we have to always be cautious on what it is about them and what they are trying to say. So in this age of secular and political correctness, it would not be remiss to look at certain saints, particularly North American saints, and project onto them the idea of holy foolishness as a way of utilizing the idea as a mirror on society. In the North American context, this takes on few forms, namely the use of life of the North American saint as an agent against powers, as a protector of the marginalized, and a model of the countercultural lifestyle. Why these particular traits seem to be of importance in the North American context will become apparent as we review the lives of the three of these figures. Again, two of them are canonized and one yet to be canonized. While the listing is not exhaustive, there are many others that we could speak about. There are meant to be descriptive prototypes for this particular manifestation. Many of the North American saints, both canonized and yet to be canonized, have attributes which can be seen as foolish-like. But the unique relationship with the power of the church in North America, which is by comparison young, developing, and clearly a minority church among the constellation of denominations in North America. And I have chosen these three simply to make the point of foolishness in North America and its effects on the general church. The three that I'm going to speak about is, the first one is St. Herman of Alaska, St. John of San Francisco, and Olga of Alaska. There are others, such as Nikolai Ajicha, who I introduced you to, Metropolitan Leonti, who's yet to be canonized, who was the primate of the church, who died in the building where I work presently, and has some interesting stories about him. Seraphim Rose, another controversial character in the United States, all have yet to be fully examined. But the point demonstrates a unique way in which foolishness is exhibited. So, St. Herman of Alaska, 1751 to 1836. He is the first American saint and part of the original mission from the Lam Monastery to the Russian-American company based in Sitka and Kodiak, Alaska. The original 9 months traveled across from the Lam all the way across Russia and Siberia, across the sea, and ended up in Alaska. 8,000 miles, the longest missionary trip of any Christian denomination in history. In response, they traveled there in response from the Russian-American company to Catherine the Great, and they arrived in Kodiak in 1794 to find an oppressed and exploited native population. The missionaries were promised by the Russian-American company a church, supplies, and monetary support, none of which was available when they arrived. Despite these difficulties, the missionaries immersed themselves into the local native society, establishing churches, orphanages, schools, providing support and baptizing over 7,000 natives, establishing a monastery and a number of churches. The missionaries spread through Alaska, with some being martyred, St. Juvenali of Iliamna, St. Peter the Aleut being two of them. Others went back to Russia. It was just too hard. In the end, only St. Herman remained to carry on the mission work. However, it became very clear very early that there was going to be a confrontation between the Russian-American company agents and the government officials who treated the local natives as slaves. The early missionaries became a zealous defender of the native Alaskans, often running afoul of local authorities who attempted to deride and even get rid of them. After a number of years, St. Herman was actually exiled from Kodiak to a little island, Spruce Island, a mile offshore of Kodiak Island. You can see from Kodiak, you can see Spruce Island, it's a mile away, and you can't get there. It'll either be totally clear and you'll get there in 45 minutes by boat, or you'll be stuck there forever, because the way the weather patterns are. So when he was exiled there, he was really exiled. Even that isolation did not hamper the Alaskan people from seeking his counsel, nor to prevent him from establishing a school, a hospital, and a chapel on the island, all which remains. There are many miracles associating from his time on Spruce Island to his death in 1836. He stopped diseases, he stopped the tidal wave by placing an icon of the Theotokos on the beach. We'll talk about some of the others, but there were a great many miracles. In 1970, the Orthodox Church in America canonized him the saint and hailed him as wonder worker of all America. If we examine St. Herman's lifestyle and some of the stories surrounding him, we find that he was quite an unusual monk, an ascetic of the highest degree, and one with prophetic vision of the place of the church. He remained a simple monk and never was ordained a priest, yet he kept all the services in the absence of the clergy. Basically, he should have been forgotten, a simple monk living in a remote and isolated region, known only by a few people, and beloved by a small group of native Alaskans. Yet his memory was kept alive through written and oral accounts, and there are a number of letters from him to the church authorities in Russia. And it is from these that we are able to discern some of these unique, foolish attributes. He loved a simple life, eating very sparingly, some vegetables or fish. His emaciated bodies were discovered after his death. As one local native stated, yes, Appa, that's the native word for father, led a very hard life. No one can imitate it. It was also discovered after his death that he secretly wore a 16-pound chain and cross underneath his clothing. His clothing was a worn deerskin shirt, which he only changed every 8 years. He slept on a bench with a brick as a pillow and a board as a blanket. He did not care about clothing. In fact, he rarely, if ever, washed. By all accounts, his ragged and disheveled appearance repelled the local Russian authorities, but the natives were drawn and attracted to him by his abounding love and care for them. In this, Father Herman followed the example of many Eastern ascetic fathers, who showed the greatest concern for the welfare of others, yet themselves wore the humblest possible clothes to show their disregard for earthly riches and their great humility before God. There are accounts of him walking barefoot in the snow, carrying huge baskets of seaweed or logs, which even 4 men could not carry. It was his love for the natives which made him stand out. This was an age where the native Alaskans were basically slaves of the Russian-American company. They worked outrageous hours in freezing conditions to gather furs for the company. That assaulted their culture and forced them to the margins of society, even on their own island. He would be heatedly involved with the rights of the local natives, which were being violated by agitation, crudeness, and immorality of the explorers and the authorities, and therefore became the victim of many violent animosities. However, he alone, out of everyone, was able to withstand all these things, and who can serve now as an example of diligence, piety, and strict morality. His protests became so heated that, as I said, the authorities exiled him from Kodiak. Yet he did not remain silent, continuing to write to officials in Russia, confronting them on Kodiak. He did not remain and caring for those placed in his care. St. Herman himself recounted, "All my life here from my own Russians, I have seen more scorn and mockery to which I have already become accustomed. And such custom, I think, that in actual fact, my lowliness is such." Yet he persevered, regardless of his own safety or health, ministering and healing the natives during the plague, caring for the abandoned and abused, and even having a miraculous intervention during a tidal wave that threatened to destroy the island. As he saw it, his mission was he was sent to minister all that God had entrusted to him, not just the Russian inhabitants. His reputation for eccentricity and holiness spread throughout Alaska, with many government officials stopping by Spruce Island to meet the holy monk. He would patiently meet with them all, listening to them, advising them, even scolding them in the presence of others in order to focus them on God. He was never shy in confronting authority. Yet, St. Herman was quick to retreat back to his hut, simple hut, in isolation and in prayer. Probably the most famous story about him is when a group of Russian officials were sent to meet him. This was a Russian admiral, a bunch of high-ranking officers in the Navy, and they went to his hut and they asked him to come aboard the ship. So here on the Russian ship, with all the finery, the military finery, sat this simple, disheveled monk. And so they were all making this conversation, and St. Herman asked, "What do you love best?" So each person in turn said what they loved. "Well, I would love to have my own ship. Oh, I would love to have a loving wife. Oh, I would love to have riches." And St. Herman turned and said to them, "What about God?" "Well, of course, yes, we all love God, right?" And then he has this wonderful answer to them. What though can be better, higher than all else? Got lost myself. It is not true that all your answer desires one thing must be concluded. Each of your gentlemen requires whatever he thinks is best and loves most. What though can be better, higher than all else, more worthy of love and more splendid than our Lord Jesus Christ himself, who created the world and adorned everything in it, who gave life to everything, who keeps everything, feeds everything, loves everything, who is loved himself. Should you not love God above all things and wish for him to seek him? And of course everyone answered, naturally, of course. As Father Herman sighed, and I, a poor sinner, have been trying these 40 years to learn how to love God. And I cannot say that I know how to love him properly. For if we love someone, we think of them always. We try to please them day and night. Our hearts and minds are full of the object of our love. So then, gentlemen, do you love God? Do you turn to him often? Do you remember him? Do you pray always to him? And do you do his will according to the Scriptures? And they admit they did not. For our goodness and for our happiness, let us vow that from this day, from this hour, from this very minute, we should try to love God above all else and carry out his teachings. And that's a very famous story of St. Herman, and one that you'll see on his icons is that quote, let us love God from this hour, from this minute, from this very second. So when St. Herman passed away, he had predicted, as many saints, his own death, and they could not get to him. The island, as I said, is very isolated, and so he sat there for many months in his hut, and when they finally came to see him, to him, he had not decomposed, and he had remained as he always been. He was buried on Kodiak, and back in 1970, it was decided to move his body from Spruce Island to Kodiak. And it's one of the only icons you'll see in the Orthodox Church which has a helicopter in it, and a Byzantine helicopter, they do exist. And they couldn't get the body off the island. The storms kept coming through every time they did. Eventually, there was a big prayer service, and they quieted, and they were able to remove his body, where it sits in the cathedral in Kodiak to this day, along with his chains, his klobuk, and a few other of his items. And it's quite humbling to actually go there and see that in this remote place of Alaska. So eventually, Alaska was sold to the United States. Yes, go on pilgrimage to Sitka. We left Archbishop Leo one year on Spruce Island. We forgot he was on the island. He was wandering around with boats flat, and all of a sudden we got to Kodiak and realized he was still there. So we turned around. Yeah, some deacons got in big trouble there. Alaska was eventually sold to the United States, and the center of the church eventually moved from Alaska down to San Francisco, and then eventually to New York, where it is now. But this shift from Alaska to the United States made a big change in the Orthodox Church in America, because you started to get immigrants over from the West Coast, but then towards the end of the century, late 19th century, early 20th century, you had the immigrants coming over from Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. That's where my family came, and that immigration from Russia after the Russian Revolution, they came over. So the next thing I want to talk about is a saint of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, St. John Maximovic, or St. John of Shanghai, or if you want to be in America, St. John of San Francisco. So we try to claim our own somehow. St. John of San Francisco is often one of the modern saints canonized in 1994 by the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, following his death in 1966. St. John is most commonly known as being a wonder worker for his long list of miraculous healings and his prophetic visions. We also have many aspects in which the holy fool was clearly evident. This is a quote from Seraphim Rose, actually. In Archbishop John, there was united three kinds of the highest Christian activity that are rarely found together: an ascetic in the tradition of the Pillar Saints, taking upon himself the severest self-mortification, and a fool for Christ's sake, instructing men by foolishness that was beyond the wisdom of this world. St. John Maximovic was born in 1896 in Ukraine, was part of the deposed refugees who fled Russia during the revolution. Like many of his fellow Russian refugees, his family fled to Serbia, where he was educated and ordained. He was eventually consecrated a bishop and assigned to the Diocese of Shanghai, which had a large Russian diaspora. He found a divided and demoralized Orthodox people, with whom he quickly involved himself and focused his ministry on healing the divisions. He refused to submit to the Soviet-dominated church, but aligned himself with Rokor, at least according to how he saw it. The Japanese invasion of China in 1937 further complicated his situation, and St. John was well known for standing up to the Japanese authorities on behalf of his people, even violating the curfew in order to minister to them. He became well known for his extreme and ascetical, prayerful life. St. John and his Orthodox community fled China after the communist takeover in 1948, first going to the Philippines. We arranged for his people to settle, while he arranged for his people to settle in the United States and Australia. He ministered in Australia and Western Europe before settling in San Francisco in 1962. His time in San Francisco was not peaceful, as his political enemies slandered him, even following a lawsuit against him, in which he was claimed that he mismanaged money raised to build the cathedral. One of the ironies is the cathedral is built, his body rests there, and the bishop who brought him up on the lawsuit was the same one who had to preside over his canonization. God has great sense of humor. He is interred there. And now that cathedral has become a place of pilgrimage, as there's a lot of miracles now associated with St. John. He was a peculiar character. When I was a priest in Las Vegas, I had a number of parishioners who actually grew up with St. John, so you got to hear stories. For one example, he would not let any of his altar boys wear ties in the altar, because they said it looked too much like an epitrachil. So when my altar boys would wear ties, the old men would come, "Oh, you're not supposed to wear ties. St. John said you can't wear ties." He walked around barefoot, served barefooted, was even known to give the poor's clothing and shoes. But he was criticized for this, but he often reminded people of the Matthew 25 commandment. He ate very little, often fasting until 11 p.m. He possessed one bowl and one spoon, which he used throughout his life. He did not eat during the first or last weeks of Great Lent, and during the Nativity fasting only ate andideren. He spent the entire night in prayer, often falling to sleep on the floor in a prostrate position. His cell attendant would awaken him with cold water, upon which he would immediately rise and go to serve the Divine Liturgy. He never missed a liturgy, even when hospitalized. His harsh ascetical discipline took a toll on his health, but he refused to compromise and continued his harsh regime until the day of his death. Two stories illustrate his unusual and even foolish ways, and I apologize in advance for one of the stories. You'll understand why. While in Marseille, France, he decided to serve a panikhida, a prayer for the departed, on the site of the assassination of King Alexander of Serbia. So he was seen walking the street in a disheveled state of dress, carrying a broom and a suitcase. He stopped in the middle of the street, like all the traffic, just stopped right in the middle of the street, swept it, put down the orlets, and served a panikhida in the middle of the street. He became known to the French as St. John the Barefoot. And I guess the French just embraced him. He was just one of these eccentric characters that was great to have walking around. Another unusual story involves a woman who had rabies and threw up the Holy Communion after she had just received it. St. John picked up the vomited communion, consumed it to the horror of the bystanders. And he replied, "Nothing will happen, these are the holy gifts." As with St. Herman, St. John loved children. He started orphanages and schools wherever he was. As Metropolitan Callistos writes, in our own day, St. John Maximovic, who had in many characteristics of the fool for Christ, likewise showed a particular love for children. He would wander the slums of Shanghai, and upon finding abandoned children, he would bring them to the church and feed them. By the time he had left Shanghai, he had taken care of hundreds of children. And he did the same thing in the Philippines and in Western Europe. And this seems to be a particular trait among fools for Christ. Because of their own freedom, they can be quite childlike themselves. So they rejoice in having children around them and encourage them to be in the church. There are numerous stories about his prophetic visions and miraculous healings, hence the title, Wonderworker. As with St. Herman, they took various forms of healing, warning people about the hazards in their lives, predicting the fate of someone, even predicting the date of his own death. St. John possessed the unique gift of presenting the healing of Christ to all those who came in contact with him, changing their lives in unimagined ways, which are still recounted by those who know him. Finally, St. John exhibited great courage, whether it was confronting the Japanese occupying army on behalf of his people, standing up to government officials who were persecuting his people, advocating for the poor and ill. He was a presence to be reckoned with, yet always doing so in a calm and peaceful manner. There is one story, and I heard this story repeated many times, but I can't get it confirmed, is that he sat on the steps of the U.S. Capitol and refused to leave there for days on end until they gave the visa to his people to come from the Philippines to the United States. And again, I'm trying to get that confirmed, but it's quite a character to see this disheveled Orthodox person sitting on the U.S. Capitol steps protesting. There's always protests there anyway. He stayed. His community was eventually allowed to immigrate. There are many stories about the sternness with this flock. My sister, who edited my paper, loves this story. In 1964, the San Francisco parishioners were in a church hall celebrating a Halloween party, instead of attending the first all-night vigil for the newly canonized St. John of Kronstadt. So St. John entered the hall, staff in hand, and went to every person at the party, and not speaking a word, stood before them and glared at each one of them, and then went to the next one, and stood in front of them and glared at them, and then went to the next one, and then he went back to the cathedral. All the people followed him, went to the cathedral for the vigil. So that's St. John. So despite the growing church in the United States, the church in Alaska continued to exist, despite the efforts by the United States government and other denominations to shut it down. And we're going to go back to Alaska now. If you don't know the history of what happened in Alaska after the sale to the United States, what basically happened is President McKinley sent in a Presbyterian minister to kind of be in charge of Alaska. And he basically said that those Orthodox are not Christians, and I'm going to wipe them out. In a generation, there won't be any Orthodox left in Alaska. So they would take a lot of these people from the villages and send them down to the United States to be re-educated and to become white. And they divided Alaska into the 4 denominations: the Roman Catholics, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Moravians for some reason. And so all the Orthodox churches had to answer them in one way or another. They're all gone. President McKinley's gone. Sheldon Jackson's gone, but the Orthodox Church is still there. So he didn't accomplish it. But it really did damage our church to a point that it never fully recovered to the level that it was prior to that. So the Orthodox Church, excuse me, stop for me. I'm almost done. The Orthodox Church in America is still exploring Matryoshka Olga's life, and there is considerable movement to put her name forward for canonization. A Yupik woman, Matryoshka Olga spent her life in the Kwethluk village on the Kuskokwim River in central Alaska, where she was born in 1916. She was the wife of a priest, Father Nikolai Michael. The Michael family is all throughout Alaska. It's a clergy family, Native Alaskan clergy family. And she is known for her spirituality, her simpleness, care for the poor, and especially for the abused women in Alaska, in which she exercised miraculous healings. Since her death in 1979, a number of people have come forward with stories of her miracles. Her grave has become a site of pilgrimage, especially for those women who have difficulty becoming pregnant. She was commonly known as the woman who never raised her voice. While the information is still being collected, there are some attributes of the Holy Fool in Matryoshka Olga. She was a small person, unimposing and devout. She would sing the prayers and the services of the church by memory and encourage all the people to follow her example. And although she had 13 children, 8 of whom survived, she and her husband took care of 12 parishes. Despite being poor, she made beautiful clothing, including all of her husband's vestments, boots, parkas, and she would give all of that away to her friends and the neighbors. In other words, she had all this beautiful stuff she would make, but she wouldn't keep it for herself. She gave it to others. Parishes hundreds of miles away would receive unsolicited gifts. And while often in want herself, she would give whatever money she had to those who were in need, to minister to those who needed it, and often served as a midwife for the many children because there was no doctor. She would often be seen working even in the late weeks of her illness, carrying water for people, cleaning the house and church, baking the prosperity, and doing other manual labor. Interestingly, over 10% of the men from her village went to seminary, which is considerable, and they all said it was because of the witness of Matryoshka Olga. But it was her ministry to abused women where she most exhibited the Holy Fool. It was often thought that she herself was abused and why she took on that special ministry. Often considered an outcast by society, Matushka Olga had a special calling to visit, minister, and heal these women through her kind action and words. Many in the church dismissed her ministry as, oh, that's only a woman. Why are you doing that? Yet, she ministered to the lowest, and even those who were abused were considered outcasts or even dogs. She would be there amongst them and pointing out their conditions and confronting the authorities on what needed to be done to help them, even though she remained poor and in ragged clothing. She exhibited a simple humbleness and humility that allowed the marginalized to find God's love through her. It is said that she knew when a woman was pregnant before the woman knew, and she would get medical assistance for pregnancy complications before the people even knew that there was a complication. She predicted her own death. She prepared the ground for her own burial. And if you're in Alaska, the weather there can be often harsh. She died in the winter. On the day of her funeral, the weather was beautiful and balmy. They were able to bury her, and then after her body was in the ground, the snow came in again, and no one can get to the grave yet. So, again, there are more stories. We're gathering them, but this is someone I think that you'll see probably in the near future being canonized. Conclusion. Normally, passive mission means people remain in one place, trying through prayer and simple holy lifestyle to achieve advanced dimensions of discipleship and spirituality. The holy, Christ-centered, and spirit-filled life which results not only attracts the attention of many, but brings observers into the acceptance of the Christian gospel, which they credit for producing such holy people. This is a common phenomenon in Orthodoxy. Very often in the Orthodox world, the concept of passive evangelism is given great weight. A passive evangelist means basically that a certain individual, by virtue of their holy life, impacts those around them. Their witness is not necessarily an active evangelism of preaching and teaching, but rather of their life and their lifestyle, which is a witness to the gospel of Christ. It would seem that as we look at these three examples of saintly foolishness from a North American perspective, this is precisely what is being done. Their words and actions, while seeming foolish to an outsider, are acting an act of evangelism. They are bringing the gospel to a people through their own unusual witness. This perhaps is the unique, though not lone attribute of the North American saint, and there are a few reasons for that. Firstly, the North American church is young by Orthodox standards. We are celebrating in the next year or so the 225th year of Orthodoxy in America. That's young for us, right? We're still arguing about things 600 years ago or 1,000 years ago. The young church is still establishing itself. The roots of the missions in North America came from missionaries being sent to serve a very specific sort of people, Russian workers or Greek immigrants or whoever they may be. But they instead ended up serving a very different set of people, like in the case of the Russian mission, the Alaskan natives. The mission expanded to take care of immigrants and in a sense became chaplains for a culture deposed from their Orthodox homeland. And for generations, the Orthodox Church focused mainly on this diaspora, and the bishops served under a foreign metropolitan. Only in the past 50 years has the Orthodox Church in North America rediscovered its missionary roots. So even with its 14 or so canonized saints, the Orthodox Church in America is still exploring how holiness and sainthood is manifested in North America. One will not find traditional fools for Christ. Instead, one finds holy men and women witnessing to the faith, exploring the edges of the spiritual life in specific circumstances. So whether it is St. Herman ministering to his flocks while in exile, or St. John wandering the streets of Shanghai and San Francisco assisting the marginalized, or Matushka Olga using her skills and talents to assist others, the same results happen. They are witnessing and trying to establish a more extreme form of Christian spirituality that is yet to take root. That is why they are so honored and revered. They are different and new to this region. The manifestation of the holy fools is often and deliberately intertwined with the relationship with power structures. The holy fools of the Golden Age deliberately and consciously acted against the power structures, whether they are the triumphal church which needs to be brought back to earth, or the government which imposed its will on the Orthodox people, leading to rebellion or desertion. They are there to shine the holy mirror on those abuses. No such power relationship exists in the United, or currently exists in the North American context. The Orthodox are a very small minority in North America, to the point of not only being disregarded, but even being relatively unknown. Unlike in majority Orthodox countries, the Orthodox Church in America has no power in the North American society. The Church is not supported by nor beholden to government subsidies or to government powers. Instead, the Orthodox live in a democratic, secular society where the ballot box gives power, not the church-state structure. This is a very different power struggle in which to go against. So for this reason, we see holy foolish directed against external powers. So whether it is St. Herman defending the natives against an abusive company, or teaching through his own example of life, whether St. John struggling for the people against the secular society, threatening to swallow them and witness in another way, or even a simple priest's wife being a witness to something more powerful and holy existing in the village. The methods are different. They are demonstrating the real meaning of the word holy, agios, or other. There is something other than what is before them. There is something other than a struggle against abuses, secularism, or neglect. And that other is a godly life. And to become, as St. Paul writes again in 1 Corinthians, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. And these holy people exhibited their foolishness precisely to be a witness of Christ and to show the foolishness of the context they loved in a genuine and organic way. So each of these demonstrate in their own unique way and context the 5 attributes of the holy foolish, as according to Metropolitan Callistus: total freedom in the world, being a stranger in the world, extreme humility to the point of being mocked, the prophetic vision, and finally, being an apostle for the Christian faith. While not being specifically fools for Christ, their foolishness brought Christ to the people to whom they themselves were ministering. They were passive evangelists to a society that either did not understand them or ignored them. Yet the power of their witness is beyond what we understand at the time, because their witness survives their time and comes to us today. And as the Apostle Paul writes, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of Christ. Amen. Thank you.
On behalf of all of you, dear fathers, brothers and sisters, I would like not only to thank Father Eric for this wonderful talk, but also to convey our thanks and greetings to His Beatitude, Metropolitan Deacon, who blessed such a prominent figure of the Church of America to present the vision on the phenomenon of the foolishness for Christ to us. And I would like to draw your attention that it is very important that we are listening to this talk on the verge of the celebrations which are going to take part in North America in the end of this year, and especially in the year 2020, connected with the 50th anniversary of the autonomy, autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in America, the 50th anniversary of the canonization of St. Herman of Alaska, whose icons you will receive in the end, and what is more important for us, the 225th anniversary of the mission in America, which is closely connected with the relics of the saints we have here today. Because yes, the older contemporary of St. Seraphim of Sarov was St. Nazari of Sarov, who was a very important person in the monastery of Sarov, transferred to the Valama monastery to establish the rules of the Sarov monastery there, and he was in fact the person who was in charge of sending this mission. And St. Herman was also raised as a monk under St. Nazari of Sarov, first in Sarov monastery, and then went with him to Valama monastery. And so the relics which we have here are very closely attached to the history of the Russian Orthodox mission in America. And so, praying today to St. Seraphim and his disciples, we distantly venerate also the saints of America, of whom Father Eric told us such an interesting story, and probably it is time now to ask more questions to Father Eric.
Anyone has some questions specifically on Father Eric's presentation? Father Michael.
Father Eric, in your very interesting talk about all the saints of the OCA, I would like to ask you, please, how is regarded and how is venerated Saint Tikhon, Patriarch of Moscow, who was many decades Archbishop of New York, who founded many cathedrals and churches and seminaries, and what is his impact on the former life and actually within the OCA, please?
He is considered, thank you for that question, he is considered by many of us in the church as the prototype of the American saint. You remember him for what he did here in Russia, the revolution, etc. He's remembered for being the one who had the real vision of what the United Orthodox Church in America should be. I was always absolutely dumbfounded as I traveled around the country where St. Tikhon ended up. So I had a parish in Montana. There was a parish in Butte, Montana that was consecrated by St. Tikhon. There was a parish in Calhoun, Colorado, which is in the middle of a bunch of Carpatho-Russian ranchers, basic cowboys, that had been consecrated by him. In Washington State, on the side of Mount Rainier, which it takes 2 hours to go through a dirt road to get there, is another church that is consecrated by him. He was the one who founded St. Tikhon's Monastery. He has such an incredible presence. He was the one who foresaw that the way to unity in North America, about uniting all the different groups under one church, but having different bishops for different groups. And it still is considered a paradigm that no one wants to adopt. But St. Tikhon is an incredible presence. Our own Metropolitan, that is his patron saint as well. And when you walk into the chapel at the Chancery, his relics are there. In fact, there are a number of wonderful things. There's a antimensium that I found on the burn pile. You know, you have a burn pile for old antimensia. And looking at it, and I don't read Slavonic very well, and I realized it was the original antimensia given to St. Innocent of Alaska when he was a priest, that he traveled by kayak. You saw this, Lydia. It's on the fireplace in the chapel. He traveled by kayak throughout all these villages in Alaska with this antimensia, which is in better shape than most of the antimensia in our churches today. So we hold these wonderful things in such gifts that we have in America. We're not filled with them, but what we have, we hold on.
Another question down here at the front.
Dear Father Eric, thank you very much for a very interesting talk about the saints of America, and especially for the talk about St. Herman of Alaska. Very dear saint.
I can tell that you kept nodding your head.
Yes, my dream is to go to Alaska, and I know quite a lot about it. He did translate a Bible into Aleutian language, so he really made it an amazing missionary for the Alaskan people and then for America as a whole. My question is very simple. Whereabouts is the grave of Matushka Olga?
It is in the village that I mentioned in Alaska. Alaska is a very different place, and what we forget is that the Native Alaskans right now there are 5 basic Native Alaskan tribes that are Orthodox. And the only reason their language survived was because of the church, because we translated all the services into their languages. And so on an average Sunday, you're going to hear those Native Alaskan languages, but also kind of they had this strange way of taking Russian words and kind of making them Native Alaskan. So instead of started it's started-tuk. So just this nice little thing. So you have the Alaskans, who are basically island people. So they live on the chains of the islands out there, and they have a particular lifestyle. Then you have the ones who live in the villages along the coast. They have a particular lifestyle. Then you have the ones that are inland. And where Matushka Olga's village is inland. So there's only 2 ways to reach it. because there's no roads, there's no airports, there's nothing. So in the winter, you can use a snowmobile and go up the river, the frozen river, or drive a car on the frozen river. Or during the summer, you can hopefully, maybe, just fight against the currents on a boat to get up there. So usually people go up there in the winter because it's easier to get there. So to get to her village is a bit of a trek, and good luck.
But what about is it?
It's
The biggest place to it.
the Kuskokwim River. It's about it's between Anchorage and Sitka.
Okay.
It's I don't think country. It's like back in the river.
Okay.
So look it up. It is interesting that how it's like someone like Saint Innocent who again traveled throughout. He became Bishop Metropolitan of Moscow, traveled throughout Alaska, but he also literally built the churches by himself. So many of our churches there were actually built by Saint Innocent. He also built an organ that he gave to the Catholic bishop in San Francisco as kind of a peace offering, which is still in a church in San Francisco. He was truly, and he had all these diaries of plant, the flora and fauna, and he was quite a remarkable person. He's just in awe. And I was just telling that the discussion group, if you ever want to really understand him and what we're supposed to do as missionaries, because we're all missionaries, read St. Innocent's Instructions to Missionaries. You can find it on the internet. It is the most remarkable cross-cultural, contextual, theological document before there was even a term, contextual theology. It's a remarkable, remarkable thing. So St. Innocent's Instructions to Missionaries. I always say that.